If you feel like you are not eating that differently, but fat loss keeps getting harder, you are not imagining it. For many people, the real reason is not obvious. The same calories can produce a very different result inside the body. And once you see what changes behind the scenes, it becomes much easier to understand why fat loss starts feeling harder than it should. Here is the hidden shift most people never see. The same calories do not arrive in the same metabolic environment all day long. Earlier in the day, the body is generally more prepared to handle incoming energy. Insulin sensitivity is usually higher, glucose tolerance is better, and the cost of processing food, what researchers call diet induced thermogenesis, also tends to be higher earlier in the day than later. That means the same meal can be handled differently depending on the hour, not because the food changed, but because the body did. Later in the day, the system becomes less efficient. The same calories are more likely to produce a longer glucose response, a longer insulin response, and a slower shift into the overnight metabolic phase. And that is the real shift. For many people, fat loss does not become harder only because they are eating more. It becomes harder because more of their intake is landing in a lower efficiency metabolic window. Once you understand that, the problem starts to look very different. It is not only about how much food enters the body, it is also about whether that food arrives when the body is biologically ready to use it well. Late eating does not happen in a vacuum. It grows out of the way daily life is built now. For many people, the first shift happens in the morning. The day starts fast. Coffee replaces breakfast. Tasks come first. Food gets pushed later. Then the middle of the day becomes unstable. Work, appointments, commuting, errands, and screen-heavy routines make lunch easier to delay, easier to shorten, and easier to miss. Meal timing research repeatedly links irregular schedules and later chronotypes with later eating patterns and a greater share of energy intake later in the day. By evening, the structure changes. That is when time finally opens up. That is when people sit down. That is when hunger becomes obvious. So dinner becomes larger not only because appetite rises, but because it is often the first part of the day that feels organized enough for a real meal. For older adults, the pattern can be even more complicated. Retirement often removes the fixed anchors that once shaped meal timing. There may be less urgency in the morning, fewer social cues around lunch, and more unstructured time later in the day. At the same time, aging can change appetite patterns. Morning hunger may be weaker. Medication schedules may interfere with eating. Sleep may become lighter or more fragmented. Energy may dip earlier in the day, then rebound into evening snacking or a later dinner. Health conditions can add another layer. People may delay eating because of nausea, reduced appetite, blood sugar concerns, digestive discomfort, dental issues, or simply not feeling ready for a full meal early in the day. Research in older adults shows that meal timing itself often shifts later with age and health changes, including later breakfast and later dinner patterns in many people. So, late eating is often not just a nutrition problem, it is a structure problem, a routine problem, and sometimes an aging pattern problem. And once daily structure changes, meal timing usually changes with it. Here is the mechanism more precisely. Your body does not process food in the same metabolic state from morning to night. Human metabolism follows a circadian rhythm, and that rhythm affects insulin sensitivity, glucose tolerance, substrate use, and the thermic effect of food. Chrononutrition reviews consistently show that glucose handling is generally more favorable earlier in the day and less favorable later, especially when intake extends toward the biological evening or night. The first layer is insulin and glucose control. Earlier in the day, the body is generally more insulin sensitive. That means glucose can be moved out of the bloodstream more efficiently with less metabolic strain. Later in the day, the same meal is more likely to produce a higher or more prolonged glucose response. Reviews of human meal timing studies describe this daytime advantage clearly. Evening intake is repeatedly linked with poorer glucose tolerance and less efficient insulin action than earlier intake. The second layer is the energy cost of processing food. Every meal requires energy to digest, absorb, and metabolize it. That cost is called diet-induced thermogenesis. And this is where meal timing becomes even more important. Review data suggests that diet-induced thermogenesis is typically higher in the morning and lower later in the day. So the same meal may not only be handled less efficiently at night, the body may also spend less energy processing it. The third layer is fuel selection. Late eating keeps the body in a fed state longer and delays the transition into overnight metabolism. That matters because the overnight phase is when the body should be moving more clearly away from incoming meal energy and towards stored fuel use. When intake is pushed later, that shift is delayed. Reviews and intervention studies describe this as lower fat oxidation and a slower transition into the overnight fasting and recovery phase. And this is not only theory. In the 2018 early time-restricted feeding trial published in Cell Metabolism, men with prediabetes followed a 6-hour eating window with dinner before 3 p.m. for 5 weeks. Compared with a 12-hour control schedule, early time-restricted feeding improved insulin sensitivity, beta cell responsiveness, blood pressure, oxidative stress, and appetite, even without weight loss. That is a very important point. The metabolic improvement happened without requiring body weight to fall first. A second key trial makes the picture even stronger. In the 2022 Cell Metabolism Late Isocaloric Eating Study, researchers kept calories controlled and shifted timing later. Late eating increased hunger, decreased energy expenditure, and changed adipose tissue biology in a direction consistent with greater fat storage. In other words, later timing did not just change blood sugar or insulin, it changed how much energy the body used and how fat tissue itself was being regulated. So when we say eating earlier may help burn more fat, even if calories stay the same, that is not casual language. It reflects three converging mechanisms: better glucose handling, higher thermic cost of food earlier in the day, and an earlier transition into the overnight phase where fat use becomes more favorable. So, what does all of that mean in practical terms? It means fat loss can become harder even when the diet does not look dramatically different on paper. Not because calories suddenly stop mattering, and not because the body broke, but because the same intake is now arriving in a less favorable metabolic window. That is exactly why meal timing research is so important. In the 2018 early time-restricted feeding trial, metabolic markers improved even without weight loss. That tells us timing was not acting like a minor detail. It was changing how the body handled energy before the scale even changed. The 2022 late eating trial makes the message even stronger. When calories were held constant and meals were shifted later, people became hungrier, used less energy while awake, and showed adipose tissue changes consistent with greater fat storage pressure. That means the problem was not simply eating more. The timing itself changed the metabolic environment. And when review papers put the broader evidence together, the pattern is very consistent. Earlier intake is generally linked with better glucose control, higher diet-induced thermogenesis, and a more favorable transition into overnight metabolism than later intake. So the real meaning is this. For many people, the issue is not that they are failing at fat loss. The issue is that more of their food is landing in a time window where the body is less prepared to use it well. That changes how much energy is spent processing the meal. It changes how long the body stays in a fed state, and it can shorten the period when overnight fat use would normally become more favorable. That is why this topic matters. It explains why fat loss can feel harder than it should, even before someone is clearly eating more. The goal is not to force an extreme schedule. It is to move eating into a more favorable part of the day. A practical pattern for most adults is simple. Eat your first real meal within 1 to 2 hours after waking. If you wake at 6:30 to 7, aim to eat by 7:30 to 8:30. If you wake later, keep the same rule. Do not let the first meal drift too far into the morning. Then anchor lunch about 4 to 5 hours later. That usually means 12 to 1 if breakfast is around 8, or 1 to 2 if breakfast is around 9. Dinner matters most. For most people, a good target is to finish dinner by 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. The key rule is this: finish the last meal at least 2 to 3 hours before sleep. So if bedtime is 10 p.m., dinner should usually end by 7 to 8 p.m. Research on meal timing and cardiometabolic health supports avoiding food too close to sleep and aligning intake earlier in the active part of the day. For older adults, the hardest part is often the morning. Morning appetite may be lower. Medication schedules, lighter sleep, and less structured routines can all push meals later. Recent research also shows that meal timing often drifts later with age, including later breakfast and dinner patterns. So, the most realistic fix is not a large breakfast. It is a small but fixed first mealtime, then a stable lunch, then an earlier dinner. If dinner is currently very late, move it earlier by 30 minutes at a time, not all at once. Meal timing is not the only factor in fat loss, but it is one of the most overlooked. And once more of your calories start landing later in the day, the body may handle that same intake in a less favorable way. That is why this matters. Not because dinner is bad, not because you need a perfect schedule, but because small shifts in timing can change the metabolic setting in which the same calories are processed. What time do you usually eat your last meal each night? And if you have a simple trick that helps you stay consistent with your eating schedule, share it in the comments.